Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. With Tony Blair's departure, the race for the Labour leadership is on. Many Labour MPs want Gordon Brown to be shooed in without a contest. But Labour left-winger John McDonnell wants to ensure that party members have a choice, that there's a debate within the party about its future direction. And here he is with me to discuss his bid to be leader of the Labour Party and future Prime Minister. Welcome, John.
Hi, Peter.
I just want to start by asking you about why are you going to challenge Gordon Brown?
I'm trying to introduce this new invention into the Labour Party. It's something the Greeks discovered ages ago. It's called democracy, where one person can have a vote and influence the future of their political party. Now, a lot of people in the Labour Party are saying, look, we don't want a coronation. We're a democratic party. Liberals and the Tories had a leadership election with a range of candidates, proper debate, and then elected their leader, and actually, as a result of that, they rose in the polls. We want to do the same thing, have a democratic debate about the policy issues, then make it serious by having a vote, and then after that, we can unite the Labour Party and defeat the Tories and win the next election. So the fundamental issue is democracy.
I think a lot of party members would probably value a debate.
I think they're desperate. And also, we've had people knocking on doors, delivering leaflets and canvassing, standing as candidates in recent elections, and it's outrageous that we ask them to do the work, and then when it comes to the serious business of deciding the future of our party and the future leader, that we say, no, you can't have a say in all of that. And so this is trying to say to the Labour Party hierarchy, in particular Gordon Brown, lighten up. Let's have an election with a smile on its face. Let's have a proper debate, comradely, friendly, policies, not personalities. And in that way, we can mobilise support, not just in the Labour Party, but outside in the community as well. I don't think the electorate will understand if we don't have an election. We're a democratic party. We're more democratic. That's our tradition than any other political party in this country.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that without an election, people will see it as a fix. Well, and, of course, the party won't have that conversation with itself or with the wider electorate.
Well, there's two issues. Really, it's just having the form of an election is one thing. When at one point in time, but they thought, well, no one's going to challenge Gordon Brown, so we'll still have an election, but we'll just have his one name on the ballot paper. Ceausescu would have been proud of that one. Well, they've dropped that now. But so we need the form of election in the sense of people can participate in deciding who's the leader. More importantly, it's deciding what the future is, what the policies are. We've been 10 years in government. We've done some good things, but we've made some horrendous mistakes as well. It enables party members to say, look, let's judge where we've got to. Let's talk about where we go from here. And if we don't allow that to happen, we'll just repeat the same mistakes of the last 10 years.
I think the public perception is that Gordon Brown has been associated with all the disastrous Blair mistakes, like the Iraq War, the renewal of the Trident nuclear missile program, national identity cards, expanded nuclear power. On all these issues, he has been very much associated and colluded with Tony Blair's agenda. What are you going to do, or what would you do that would be different?
Well, I want the exact point that you've just made. I want to make sure people know that actually by electing Gordon Brown, we're actually going to a policy of no change, because it's been a dual leadership. He's been the architect of most of the policies that we've implemented over the last 10 years. And if he hasn't been the architect, he's voted for them. You take the Iraq War, he's not just voted for it, he's funded it. And so if we do have Gordon Brown as our next leader of the Labour Party, our next Prime Minister, I'm saying to people, don't expect any radical change, and that's what we need. My view is we need a radical break with New Labour. It's a whole range of things. I don't want to get schematic, but I'll run through them. You've mentioned most of them. In terms of peace, we're either a party in favour of peace or war. If we're a party of peace, which we've always been as a Labour Party, that was why we were founded, we withdraw from Iraq. It's as simple as that. We never again enter into a military adventure that was Iraq. And we break this bizarre military alliance that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown have forged with George Bush, the most right-wing reactionary president of the United States of America that we've seen in 2 generations. Now, it's those sort of issues. On nuclear weapons, it's just straightforward. You're either in favour of peace or you're in favour of war. If you're in favour of peace, you don't go down the path of investing. Well, the government says now 26 billion. We know from the Guardian leak before Christmas that it was 76 billion pounds in nuclear weapons and unusable. But then also it looks as though in his final weeks, Blair's trying to cook up a deal with Bush to get the ballistic missile system located in the UK as well, which Gordon Brown must be going along with too. So on that sort of issue, really stark contrast between the two. You mentioned the issue of privatisation. Straightforward choice. You're either in favour of public services or in favour of privatisation.
I didn't mention it, but you have, and I'm glad you have. I'm glad you have. Yeah,
well,
yeah,
if you didn't, I thought you should have done. On the public services front, if you remember in '97, health workers, public sector workers, marched out for us to get us elected, to get rid of the Tories. And it was because of privatisation and cutbacks in public services. Those workers are marching again all over the country, but they're not marching for us, they're marching against us. And the bizarre thing is, I've been campaigning up in Scotland, in the Coatbridge constituency, Monklands, where John Reid is one of the MPs nearby. They're closing the accident emergency unit, and he's a cabinet member, voting for it in cabinet, but campaigning against it in his own constituency. So there's these strange contradictions that have occurred. So what I'm saying is, if you're in favour of public services, you invest in public services. You make sure they're managed by the workers themselves who provide the services, involving the patients, involving the people who consume the services, and involving local democratic representation. You don't go down this Gordon Brown path of privatisation.
And it's a very good point you've raised. You haven't used the word economic democracy, but that's what you're saying. Yeah. We have an extraordinary political system where everybody's got one vote, in a general election. Yeah. But in terms of how the economy's run, all the votes are held by the rich and powerful, and the people who actually run the services, provide the services, with all their knowledge and expertise, are pretty much powerless.
Excluded.
Yeah.
I'm a socialist. What does socialism mean? You'll remember, during the 80s, I think it was Neil Kinnock sent Bernard Crickoff, the professor of politics, to come back with a booklet defining what socialism was, what the Labour Party values was. He came back with a really good phrase, which is about socialism is about achievement of equality through democracy. And that isn't just about economic equality, it's about empowerment as well. Now, I'm a socialist, so what I want to do is empower people, and that does mean allowing people to have control not just once every 5 years through a ballot box, but actually having control of their communities through active participatory democracy, but also when they go to work as well, because that's an important part of their lives. And if we built that model of public services, which was about those who provide the services, those who receive them, but also having democratic representation for local communities, on that basis, not only would you get, I think, more democratic services, you get more efficient and more effective services as well. And people would commit themselves to it.
So less unelected appointed quangos and more mechanisms for the consumers and the producers to be part of that process. Yeah,
I think the real fundamental mistake in public sector investment over the last 10 years is that we poured money into the NHS. Absolutely poured money. And I congratulate Gordon Brown from that. But what's happened is that about a third of that money has been laundered out of the NHS through privatisation into private profits. A lot of that money has been spent on building this managerial base, which is completely unaccountable to either the people who receive the services or the frontline staff who deliver them. And so NHS workers themselves feel completely alienated from the very service that they're providing. Now, that isn't what we were elected for in '97. And what I'm trying to say on all these issues now, let's have a debate. And one way of having that debate and making it meaningful is this leadership election, because you can have the debate and at the end of it you can then come to a conclusion and use your vote to elect someone who will represent what you think is the right way forward. If it's just a debate without a vote and without having any effect whatsoever on where we go from here and who's going to take us there together, it's meaningless. It's just words upon the air again.
Since you raised the issue of democracy, I mean, one issue that is very pertinent to Labour Party members is the issue of internal party democracy. Yeah. It's one of the reasons I left Labour, because I just felt that the grassroots membership is really shut out from decision-making, and the annual conference is now just a rubber stamp for the leadership. It's like, run like the Central Committee of the Soviet Union. Downing Street decides everything, and the members, just voting fodder and election campaign fodder. I mean, how would you change that?
Well, let me give you an example why it's important. Because it isn't just a matter of democracy as a principle, it's also practice in the real world. You'll know that for 3 years running, we've had a resolution up to the Labour Party conference with regard to council housing. When I was elected in '97 in London, we had 40,000 homeless families. We've now got 65,000. In my constituency, I've got 2,000. And if you came to my advice session every Friday, you could sit down and weep at the suffering as a result of people living in appalling housing conditions, exploited by Rachmanite landlords who live off the housing benefit system, in overcrowded conditions as well, have no prospect of having a home of their own, a roof over their heads. That's because we haven't built council houses. Yet for 3 years running, we've passed resolutions at Labour Party conference saying we need to build council houses again, and it's been completely ignored by the government. Interestingly enough, that's what's caused the housing crisis. We're not building homes, therefore there's a shortage, prices go up and people can't afford them. Now, there's a practical reality to democracy. If you close down democracy, you arrive at decisions at the end of the day that no longer represent what's happening in the real world. So one of the issues for me is restoring democracy in the Labour Party at every level, both in terms of local communities, local constituencies, allowing them to select their candidates again, rather than having all these new Labour candidates parachuted into their constituencies. Going back to the tradition we had when you were selected as a Labour Party candidate, someone who lives in the community, is part of it, is active in the campaigns within that area. It's that sort of thing. And then allowing decisions at Labour Party conference to be, really to be abided by government when in power. It isn't just about respecting them, it's about implementing them. Now, there's other issues of democracy in the party. I'll give you an example. Parliamentary Labour Party, I'm a Labour MP. Parliamentary Labour Party has had one vote at its meetings in 10 years. What do you think it was on? Iraq, tuition fees? No, it was on the disciplinary procedures against MPs who speak out against the party. So democracy at every level within the Parliamentary Labour Party. Cabinet, we know from Robin Cook's diaries and David Blunkett's diaries that at times Cabinet meets for 20 minutes and that's it. So you get this very close centralisation of power around the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. What I want to do is I want to break that all down and re-establish democracy that the Labour Party member can go back to the tradition where they can turn up at a branch meeting, move a resolution, that resolution can go to Labour Party conference, get passed by conference and then implemented by a Labour government. Now, it didn't always work like that, but at least you had a chance of doing that. Now there's virtually no chance whatsoever.
And what about the wider democracy, the democratic deficit in our society as a whole? You know, we have an unelected second chamber still.
Yeah, well, my view initially was to scrap the House of Lords altogether. I've turned around on that one. I want to scrap the House of Lords, but I do think we need a second chamber. I've realised the value of having an amending chamber. So the first elected chamber is the one with authority that elects the government and the ministers are drawn from it. The second chamber, I think, is an amending chamber. So we look a bit more towards the American or European models for that. So I understand that. But it's more than that. It's more than just a ballot every 5 years. I think it's about democracy within communities, breaking it down to small communities, people running their own estates, people being able to manage their own local service at the local level, people having the right to be heard as well. Local government in this country has been destroyed over the last 20 years. You know, I was a GRC councillor. Thatcher scrapped us, took away our powers to levy our own local rates. So most of the funding now comes from central government. So we need to give powers back to local councils, but also give them the resources to get on with things like building the homes we need.
And what about the electoral system? I noticed recently you said in Tribune that you were pretty much happy with the existing first past the post, which I think, you know, every system's got its flaws, but how can we ever justify a government that won a fifth of eligible voters but bagged 55% of the seats, which is what the current government has?
Yeah.
It's just, you've got to have socialism by consent, not by electoral ruse and trickery.
I accept that. At the same time, I don't like the idea of a small party wagging the tail of the dog of the majority, if you like. And to be honest, I'm a complete pragmatist on this. I'm a socialist. What will advance socialism? And part of socialism, you're right, is democracy. So again, on a number of issues now, particularly with regard to national government, I still prefer first past the post because I think that gives a stability to government and allows parties to contest and implement policies. But I've been looking at what's happened in Scotland, Wales and elsewhere in terms of local government and in the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly. And I know there's been chaos over the new system we've introduced at the local level in Scotland. That's only because people haven't had the system explained to them properly. But I can see where there's a role for proportional representation at different stages in government itself.
I mean, the good thing about the Scottish system, for example, is it maintains the constituency link, which I agree is very important,
exactly.
but does allow for a number of top-up SPs to just ensure that the vote reflects people's will. And I think, you know, the big problem about our system today for Westminster is that so many votes are wasted. And I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of people feel alienated, that it's no point voting in constituency X because so-and-so will always get in.
I think that's less so now, but if you look at the London government system that we've got as well, which is constituency A plus list, again, that works reasonably well. The only worry I've got again about the list, system. It still gets controlled by parties to a large extent. And
you could have an open list.
That's true.
Yeah.
But on the list systems that we've got at the moment, you know as well as I do that I would never get on a list with the Labour Party, would I? Or I'd be 1005th or something like that. So there's complications on all those systems. The key thing for me is to look at democracy in a meaningful way at the very local level, both in terms of community but also in the workplace. And how can people exercise some form of empowerment within their local communities and in the workplace? So, for example, we've had an erosion of civil liberties in this country and trade union rights in particular over the last 30 years. Thatcher introduced anti-trade union legislation because she saw that that was a power base for working people and therefore she wanted to eliminate it if they were going to maximise their profit take from people. What we need to do now is restore trade union rights. I'm sponsoring a trade union freedom bill in Parliament at the moment, just to simply allow people to have the right to take strike action, sympathetic strike action. We now have less trade union rights in this country now than 100 years ago, since the first trade union legislation. We've got the worst trade union rights right the way across Europe. Again, I want to have rights at work re-established. One of those rights at work would also be is if a majority feel that they want to have a say in the running of that company, they can put workers onto the boards at some future time as well. If they feel, as has happened in other countries in Europe, that a majority want to be involved in some part of ownership of that country on a cooperative of that company on a cooperative model or something like that, they have the right to move towards that model as well. In that way, I think you break down this alienation within society that we've got at the moment. People feel they're empowered and participating.
Yeah, I think your emphasis on social justice combined with democracy is both interesting and also very distinctive from the Gordon Brown agenda. You know, he's not talking about any of those issues. And as you say, it just seems to be with him, it's going to be more and more of the same. I'm
trying to encourage a discussion about what does 21st century socialism mean. They keep on branding me as old Labour or something like that. I'm not old Labour or new Labour, I'm just Labour. I'm a socialist. And I believe in community socialism. And that means empowerment, but it does mean about redistribution of wealth, because you need to make sure people have a decent quality of living. And the worst thing about the last 10 years, I think, is that we now live in a more unequal society than any time since the Second World War. And that's scandalous.
How would you adjust the tax system? Because obviously, you know, Gordon Brown seems to be trying to outdo the Tories and sort of with tax cuts and so on.
Well, it would be nice if, for example, we got corporations to pay their taxes. You know, the Labour in the past has always got into this debate around income tax. That's almost irrelevant. I agree with people earning over £100,000 paying more, 60% rate or something like that of income. But that's small beer, really. The big money is actually relating to what's happened in corporation tax and the corporations. I chair an economic advisory panel which brings together the Tax Justice Campaign and a range of other independent economists like Prem Seeker, the Professor of Accountancy at University of Essex. Now, they looked at how much tax was being avoided by corporations, and every year their estimate now is between 90 billion and 150 billion. That's a staggering amount.
How do they, just for the viewers, how do they get around that? How do they avoid
the use of offshore tax havens, various tax avoidance schemes that they introduce. And what really, I have to say, angered me about Gordon Brown's last budget is that, if you recall, he cut the 10p rate of tax, which helped the poorest, and then he reduced corporation tax from 30 to 28p to actually help the richest. And last Christmas, in the City of London, they awarded themselves £10 billion worth of bonuses alone. Absolute scandal. When we've got now, after 10 years of a Labour government, we've got 3.8 million children still living in poverty. That's the government's figures. 2 million pensioners living in poverty in this country. Shouldn't be like that after 10 years of a Labour government with the majorities that we've had and with the economic circumstances that we've had as well. And in terms of affordable housing, that's a very, very big issue now. I mean, what kind of agenda do you have to sort of address that issue? What the government has done over the last 10 years is stood back and allowed the market to let rip. You know, also, it's not our problem. The market will deal with it. And so what the market has done is what the market always does, is when there's a shortage, it will increase its prices and maximise its profits. What we need to do is intervene. We need a government that intervenes, and that means building for social need. So we build council houses again. They could be cooperatives. Can you remember on the GLC we did Coin Street Cooperative Development? We had a battle. They were trying to sell that land for profit. I was involved in the campaign myself. Right. We bought it, and they were threatening sort of legal action. I was chair of the Finance Committee. We bought it. We handed it over and built a community, a cooperative community there. It's that sort of development, giving power back to local communities to tackle the housing need in their area, using the council as a vehicle when necessary. So getting back to council housing, cooperative housing. Housing associations used to be community initiatives. Now they've transformed themselves almost into private companies, big business, that sort of thing, not accountable to their tenants anymore. I think we need to get back to that smaller scale organisational development, which allows us to provide the homes, but provide the homes that people need and that they can self-manage as well.
And how would you fund this?
Well, straightforwardly, we'd allow councils to borrow again. You know, it's the cheapest way of raising funds. When I was chair of finance on the GLC, we had a £3 billion budget, and we'd borrow on the city. We'd get the lowest rates possible because we had such wealth as a capital city, and we'd use that in the long term as any private person would use as a mortgage. We'd borrow the money to build the home, and in the long term it would be returned to us in rents, and it stacked up perfectly. If you remember, after the Second World War, Clem Attlee was a Labour leader. We'd come out of the Second World War, we had a massive housing crisis, bomb damage right the way across the country, and we put people to work to build the homes, borrowed the money to do that, and we gave people decent homes at very high standards, the Parker Morris standards. And so most of those council houses now, people are still living in, 60 years on. I was brought up in one. We should go back to that. And in that way, we can build again, house people again, but we can do it in a way which involves them and gives them control.
It's very interesting because what you're saying is pretty obvious, and it used to be the accepted, way of doing things. Yeah. But it's, if you like, the after effect of Thatcherism is that these issues, these approaches, these ways of financing things have just sort of fallen off Labour's agenda. Yeah, well,
I think I'm campaigning against Thatcher's children, really, aren't I? People who are completely imbued by the values and there was hegemony, wasn't there? The market will always provide it. The market, the hidden hand of the market will always be the optimum solution. People have learnt over the last 10 years that actually that's not the case. And that's why we've got this vast inequality and still levels of poverty. And people feel very alienated, and particularly the new generation that's coming up. Our job, I think, as commentators, politicians, community activists or whatever, is to say, actually, there is an alternative and it's in your hands. And actually, through solidarity, working together, we can shape our own futures. You don't have to be the passive recipients of whatever the market doles down to you. That's revolutionary thinking in terms of New Labour, but many people are coming that way because they've tried every other mechanism, it hasn't worked.
I think, what you're presenting is a very optimistic, positive agenda, a way of addressing social problems, which you just don't hear within the Labour Party or any other party anymore.
Well, it's exciting as well, but I'm trying to get away from saying this is... I'm not talking about any golden age of the past. I'm not going backwards. I want to go forwards. That's why I keep on saying it's redefining socialism in the 21st century. And what I'm trying to say to people is get real as well. Come to terms with globalisation. And Gordon Brown says we should be evangelists for globalisation. And what he means by that is globalised markets. And he's introduced... See, New Labour has introduced the market mechanism deep into the psyche of the British mind and the British economy. And New Labour has opened up the welfare state for privatisation as part of that globalisation process. What I'm trying to say, we need to understand that. And if we can understand how globalisation has worked, then we can actually understand how we need to work together, both nationally, but more importantly, internationally, to tackle the problems that globalisation causes. Now, if you look at the world today, 200 transnational corporations control about 60% of trade, completely unfettered, because the IMF, the World Bank and all the rest have been recruited to their cause of maximising their profits, basically. Through the labour and trade union movement and through progressive movements generally, we need to think through how we tackle that. And we do it through solidarity. That's our basic... We bind together, we come together, look at alternative solutions, campaign from them, and from a position of strength, because we're the many, not the few, we can actually then change and plan for the long-term future of our lives. Now, that's quite an exciting project. I'm trying to overcome the mystification that there is no alternative, because that's the thing that's always held us back. There's lots of alternatives.
I think a lot of people are very disappointed with Gordon Brown. Both he and Tony Blair have talked a lot about tackling climate change, but we've got an air passenger duty. It raises a lot, nearly £2 billion, but that money is not being spent on tackling climate change. It just goes into the exchequer and is used to fund ID cards, the Iraq War or whatever. So what's your agenda about tackling climate change?
I think I want to pose it as part of globalisation. You know, this is about plundering the world for profit, isn't it? This is about companies plundering our natural resources to maximise their profits. If we understand it in that way, we'll realise why this has occurred. And actually, it does go back to some of the earliest thinkers, including Marx, where they were even then explaining 2 centuries ago that the world is finite. And eventually we will come to the end of its resources unless we plan for it to be renewed. Engage in that dialogue and that analysis, we can do it. Now, let's use aviation as an example. I've got Heathrow Airport, the largest airport in this country, in my constituency. Every government, Labour and Tory, successive governments, the aviation industry has been able to pick up the phone to number 10, to the Prime Minister, and get whatever they want, in terms of tax deals, in terms of development of the airport. So I'm facing in my constituency a 5th terminal now being completed, a 3rd runway, which will demolish, well, something like 4,000 homes, 10,000 people forcibly removed from their communities, and then as a result of that runway, West London being polluted by air pollution on a scale which will poison large numbers of people. Now, at the same time, we know that aviation will be contributing to the worst pollution in the future. It will most probably amount to more than all the rest of industry put together in terms of its impact on climate change. You simply control it, don't you? You simply say, we cannot live like this anymore. So instead of just imposing duties and taxes on them, you actually say, we're now going to plan not for expansion, but for retraction. And we're going to look at the alternative. And the alternative is starkly obvious in this country. It's rail. You know, it's investing in rail. And we've failed to do that. And why have we failed to do it? Because we've privatised it for profit rather than for planning for social need. So those solutions are strikingly obvious when you explain it to people. And then what we want them to do is say, right, translate your commitment to that explanation into a vote at government level to elect politicians who will implement these policies.
So you'd be in favour of like high-speed rail links between major cities, like on the French or the Japanese model?
Yes, that's right. People are going to travel. You know, we want people to travel. That's the way they mix and understand and learn from each other. But what we've got to do is make sure they travel in a sustainable way. And the obvious solution in our country and Europe in particular is that it is rail rather than aviation. We've got to be brave enough to say that. But if you look in government at the moment, and again, this is almost nauseating, you look at the way policies are developed. Around that advisory table to every minister will be advisors from the civil service, of course, but 2/3 of the rest of the advisors will be from the private sector, all of whom are either from the private sector or going to the private sector, and their main interest is not the long-term interest of the country, it's the short-term interest of the profits of their particular companies or their industrial sector. That's what's happened in transport. That's why we've gone along with massive investment in aviation, expansion of aviation, rather than investment in rail and sustainable systems like that. Interesting, isn't it, that you look back on the last 20 years and you can see how decisions have been formulated, even within opposition in certain parties, by the dominance of certain industrial sectors to maximise their profits. Aviation is a classic example.
And in terms of renewable energy?
Very straightforward, isn't it? As a country, we should pride ourselves on that we were very early on in the development of the science of renewables. We developed the engineering, and then what did we do? We failed to implement it. And we've marketed it abroad but not used it here. So it's very, very straightforward, isn't it? We can now we know what to do. We actually develop a system whereby we develop renewable energy sources, and at the same time we go back to local production rather than national grids. In that way we're more efficient and effective.
Well, John McDonnell, you've outlined some very clear, credible alternatives. I, for one, although I'm in the Green Party, I wish you well. I hope you win the Labour leadership. I would love to see you as the next Prime Minister of Britain. Thank you, John McDonnell, and please join us next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.